To understand my story, you need to know a little about the trespassing laws in our country. Basically, we don't really have any. As long as you're respectful and don't cause damage, you can walk across any hills you want. In my case, that meant camping on any beach I chose, as long as I left the area exactly how I found it. When I was younger, I loved camping. Our family went multiple times a year with a big group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were about 10 of us at a time, which made things a bit tricky logistically since we always camped at the same remote beach along the coastline. We weren't the only ones, though. There were always yachts floating just offshore with people on them and other campers lining the beach. Most of them had kids or teens, so it was more of a relaxed family getaway than a rowdy party scene. There was even a small building with bathrooms and showers nearby, despite the location being pretty remote. I guess the local authorities got tired of people relieving themselves behind the bushes. One particular trip happened in the spring of 2011. I know this because I had just gotten my dog in the winter of 2010. I had picked her out that November from a shelter as a birthday present to myself, paying her adoption fee. Let me introduce you to her. Maple came to me as a 6-month-old puppy, rescued from a dogfighting situation. We're not entirely sure what mix of breeds she is, but our best guess is part greyhound and part terrier. She's an incredibly good-natured dog with both people and most other dogs. But if she feels threatened, she's not one to back down. By the time of this camping trip, I had owned Maple for a few months. She had never been on a camping trip before, but as far as my family was concerned, dogs always came along on these adventures. So when we loaded up the car, she came too. Oddly enough, this time none of our family friends could join us. So it was just me, my sister, my mom, and my dad. I didn't really mind, though. I wasn't particularly close to the other kids, and I'd rather play with my dog anyway. The drive took nearly 6 hours. We left later than usual, though I can't recall why, and as a result, we arrived just as the sun was setting. Not exactly the best time to be setting up camp. We expected to see other campers already set up with campfires lighting the beach, but surprisingly, it was completely empty. Even so, my parents started unloading the gear and assembling the tent. They asked my sister and me to grab some lighter bags from the trunk. I rolled down the car window a bit for Maple before stepping out, since it was unseasonably warm. As we fumbled around in the dark, the atmosphere felt eerie. The only road leading to this beach formed a circular loop, with a bridge over the water, meaning someone could essentially drive around the area in an oval pattern if they wanted to. About 15 minutes into setting up, my mom suddenly asked my dad, "Have you noticed that car going around? It's passed by a few times." My dad shrugged it off. He's like that. I don't remember if he even responded, but a few minutes later, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. The distance from our cars to where we were was about 20 feet, and with the dim lighting, we could barely see. My mom muttered that maybe it was a security officer or someone from the wildlife department, as they occasionally patrolled the area. But the man was walking unsteadily, stumbling like he was drunk or high. Then, as he stepped into the beam of our flashlight, we saw it. He was carrying a large knife. I didn't like my dad much, but I'll give him credit. He reacted immediately. He grabbed the camping mallet and put himself between us and the man. The guy started shouting at us, saying we weren't allowed to camp there. My dad tried to de-escalate things, saying that was fine and we'd leave, but the man kept coming closer. My dad raised his voice, but so did the man. My sister and I were crying, and I was shaking. I was absolutely terrified. It really seemed like my dad and this man were about to fight, and to be honest, I didn't think my dad stood much of a chance. It's grim to think about, but I am convinced that man would have killed my dad, and maybe us too. My mom, bless her, was not the kind of person to think fast in an emergency. But that's not what happened. Maple was like a wolf, an apex predator. She lunged at the man, sinking her teeth into his arm, ripping his jacket and the skin beneath it. He screamed, dropping the knife since she had clamped onto his dominant arm. He kicked at her, punched her, and eventually managed to shake her off. Grabbing his knife from the sand, he stumbled back to his car and sped away. Maple didn't chase him. We packed up in record time and piled into the car. All of us rattled. I checked Maple over. She was okay, but I noticed the window was rolled down much farther than I had left it. We think that when the shouting started, she must have put her paws on the opening, and since it was an older car with manual windows, she might have managed to push it down enough to squeeze out. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Since we had the dog with us, booking a hotel wasn't an option, so my parents decided we'd just drive home. But first, we needed gas. As we drove into the nearest town, we found a station, but it looked closed. My dad pulled up to check the hours posted on the door, sticking his head out the window. My mom asked what he was doing, and he told her he was checking when they opened. My stomach dropped. Parked in the shadows, behind a van where we hadn't noticed him at first, was the same man. He was sitting on the hood of his car, using tissues to clean the deep gashes on his arm. Without stopping, my dad hit the gas and drove straight out of town. The problem? The next town was 60 miles away, and we didn't have enough fuel to make it. Then, headlights flared up behind us. It was him. He was following us. He must have figured out we were low on gas. The next 30 minutes were some of the most terrifying of my life. We were all trying to stay calm, but my sister and I weren't little kids. We knew how serious the situation was. My dad shut off the radio, and for 50 miles, the man stayed right behind us. Then, finally, he turned onto another road and disappeared. We were running on empty, barely making it to the next gas station. I don't know how, but somehow we did. We filled the tank and drove the rest of the way home. My sister and I fell asleep in the car. I only woke up once, when we pulled into our driveway, safe at last. The next day, my mom called the non-emergency police line to report what had happened. They never followed up, but the woman on the phone mentioned that the man fit the description of someone wanted in connection to a murder case. I don't know if it was really him or just some other violent maniac. We never found out. So what's the lesson here? For me, it's that I love my dog. Maple is still with us today. I don't know why she did what she did that night. I'll never know what went through her mind. But she saved us, and I will always be grateful. I live in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina. It's a gorgeous region, full of sprawling national forests, scenic state parks, and plenty of amazing camping spots. Unfortunately, my hometown is also quite poor. While there are a few out-of-town folks from Charlotte and other cities, most people around here struggle financially. I work remotely as a freelance writer, which allows me to stay here. If I didn't have that, I'd probably have to move. It's one of those small towns where opportunities are limited unless you're a doctor, lawyer, or working at the power company. Other than that, the only jobs are at fast food places, grocery stores, and the local Walmart. To the west of my town lies an enormous national forest. It has excellent camping areas and lesser-known hiking trails that I love exploring with my dog. However, it can sometimes feel unsettling. The forest is about a 15-minute drive from town, and once you're in, there's no cell service and no houses for miles. Over the years, there have been numerous car break-ins at the trailheads. Some of the parking areas are littered with shattered glass, likely from broken car windows. At times, sketchy-looking individuals linger around the trails or drive the rugged Forest Service roads in beat-up old cars. These dirt roads are meant for four-wheel drives, yet you'll see rusted-out sedans bouncing along like they don't belong. Some of the people you come across give off the same unsettling vibe as those shady characters from crime dramas. That being said, it's still a fantastic place to camp, as long as you stay aware of your surroundings. A few years ago, 2 friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. Probably not the best idea, but we figured it would be fun. We turned the paintball outing into an overnight trip so we could keep playing the next morning. After spending most of the day shooting at each other, we packed up and drove a couple of miles to a well-known campsite. Unfortunately, a large group, possibly a church retreat, had occupied every available spot. Since this was the only site we were familiar with and it was getting late, we were left scrambling for an alternative. We spent the next hour driving deeper into the forest, looking for a place to set up camp. By now, the sun had nearly set, and we were growing anxious about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our phones, but with no signal, they were useless. Eventually, we turned onto an unfamiliar road that was in rough shape. It looked as though the forest rangers had intentionally blocked it with a dirt mound and a broken metal gate, which was lying in the woods nearby. However, it was clear that off-road vehicles had been driving over the mound for a while. Since my friend's truck had high clearance, we decided to go for it. On the other side, an old gravel road stretched ahead, mostly free of debris. We followed it for a few miles until we found a clearing by a small creek. A few blue tarps hung over a makeshift wooden table nailed to a tree, which seemed odd. However, given how late it was, we decided to stay. Leaving the truck's headlights on, we began setting up camp. As we did, I noticed a surprising amount of garbage scattered in the woods around us. One item caught my eye: a green bottle with a label that read, "Agricultural insecticide." I was too exhausted to think much of it, assuming someone had dumped their household trash. None of us found it strange that someone would drive over an hour into the woods just to leave garbage behind. We settled in, had a few beers, and cooked some homemade chili. By now, it was close to 11 p.m. As we ate, we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was just moonlight filtering through the trees, but the angle didn't make sense. The glow wasn't flickering or moving. It had the eerie steadiness of city lights seen from a distance. Since there were no other roads in the area, we ruled out other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile away, so we decided to check it out. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have, but with some rum and cokes in our systems, my friend James and I felt bold enough to investigate. Our other friend, Ethan, opted to stay behind and tend the fire. As we hiked toward the glow, things got stranger. The trees around us had their bark stripped in neat circles around their trunks. We joked that maybe a ghostly beaver was responsible, laughing a bit too loudly thanks to the alcohol. Just as we neared the top of the hill, James tripped and cursed loudly. The instant he did, the glow vanished. We looked at each other, suddenly less eager to keep going. Without a word, we turned around and made our way back, switching off our flashlights and using only the moonlight to navigate. As we neared the campsite, I saw Ethan walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat I hadn't seen before and carrying his paintball gun. That seemed odd. The fire had burned low, making it hard to see clearly, but from a distance, he appeared to be searching for something, peering into the tent and pacing around. Then, just as we were about to call out, he walked up the road we had driven in on. Figuring he was heading off to use the bathroom, we went back to the fire and waited. A few minutes later, Ethan suddenly lurched out of the tent and vomited. Apparently, he had downed a few more drinks while we were gone. We asked why he had been pacing around the campsite with his paintball gun, and he just stared at us in confusion. "They're locked in the truck," he said. We rushed over to check. The truck was still locked, and all our paintball gear was exactly where we had left it. The keys remained in the hidden compartment underneath. A sinking feeling hit me. "Ethan, what were you doing while we were gone?" I asked. Watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. "But you were walking around, and you had a hood on." He looked even more confused. "I've been in the tent the whole time, and I've been wearing this fleece all night. Someone else had been in our campsite." At that point, we were too freaked out to stay. Too drunk to drive properly, but unwilling to risk sticking around, we hastily packed up. We didn't even bother taking down the tent properly. We just collapsed it with everything inside, threw it in the truck, and got ready to leave. As we approached the dirt mound, something blocked our path. The metal barrier that had been lying on the ground earlier was now back in place, standing upright. We had sobered up enough to realize this was no coincidence. None of us wanted to get out of the truck, but the barrier had to be moved. Luckily, my friend's truck had a guard on the front, so he inched forward and nudged the barrier. It toppled over. It had only been balanced on top of the dirt. As we drove over it, I checked the rearview mirror. A vehicle was following us. Its headlights were off, but we caught glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off its surface. It stayed about 1,000 feet behind us, never closing the distance, but never falling too far back either. I drove as fast as I could down the bumpy dirt road. The shadowy vehicle remained just out of reach, always lingering 1 or 2 turns behind. It took us nearly an hour to reach the main road. As soon as we hit pavement, I took a different route home just to be safe. We never saw the vehicle again. Since that night, I've passed by that metal barrier a few times. It's always been locked in place. I have no idea who or what was out there with us, but I'll never go down that road again. A few years back, I had an experience that still sticks with me. It all started when my closest buddy and I were talking about how we needed to go on another camping trip soon. We're both outdoorsy and try to get out into nature a couple of times each month. It was late October in North Carolina, a time when the weather can swing between mild and freezing. That year, it was freezing. Our girlfriends had been playfully giving us a hard time about never taking them along, probably because our trips often involved rough conditions, cold, wet, and uncomfortable. We were actually shocked they even wanted to come, but in our eyes, the tougher the conditions, the better the adventure. Just the usual stubborn male mindset. Honestly, I was excited they wanted to tag along, so we planned a trip for the upcoming weekend. Saturday arrived, and we had everything packed and ready for the great outdoors. We drove about 2.5 hours west, deep into the mountains. As we neared our hidden camping spot, the temperature dropped even more, and it started drizzling. I could tell my girlfriend was getting uneasy about setting up camp in the worsening weather. My friend and I reassured her that we'd done this plenty of times. It was nothing new. Our chosen spot was essentially a secluded overlook, a place you could pull up to and admire the mountains. By the time we arrived, night had already fallen, so all we could see was the faint glow of a distant city skyline. Anyone who's been in the mountains knows that once the sun dips behind the peaks, darkness sets in fast. With the cold, rain, and wind whipping around us, I could see our girlfriend's excitement fading into regret. To get to our camping site, there was a small trail leading away from the overlook. The trail sharply dropped down a rocky slope, about a 70-foot descent, covered in loose stones. It wasn't an official trail, more like a secret spot people might sneak off to for privacy. Technically, camping wasn't allowed there, but we were young and overconfident, thinking we had found our own hidden getaway. Navigating the descent was tricky, so we always moved slowly to avoid injuries. We grabbed our gear and started making our way down. My girlfriend and I had walked about 50 yards from the car to the trail entrance, set down our packs, and waited for my friend and his girlfriend. A couple of minutes passed, then a few more. We started wondering what was taking them so long. It was cold and raining, so our patience was wearing thin. After 5 to 10 minutes, I decided to go back and check. As I approached the car, I could hear them arguing. "What's going on?" I asked. "He locked the damn keys in the car," his girlfriend snapped. Great. It was nearly 10 p.m., freezing, and we had no cell signal. The closest town was 20 miles away. I was frustrated because if there was one thing not to do right now, it was that. I walked back to update my girlfriend. She has a joint condition that makes her ache in cold and damp weather, and I could tell she was starting to feel it. I called out to my friend, letting him know we were heading down to get a fire going since she needed warmth. I planned to come back up later to help him sort out the car issue. We switched on our headlamps and carefully made our way down the steep, slippery rocks. The mist was the worst part. It caught the light from our lamps and reflected it back, making it nearly impossible to see. We had to take turns passing gear down to each other, inching our way lower. It was slow, but we were making progress. Then my girlfriend suddenly stopped. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. I squinted through the fog and spotted a tarp. "Oh, nice. Free tarp," I said, figuring it had blown down from above and got stuck there. I moved closer to grab it, thinking we'd scored some extra gear. Then something else caught my eye, a small plastic shopping basket, the kind from grocery stores. It looked like it had snack wrappers in it. I turned back to my girlfriend. Her face had gone pale. "Is there a person under that tarp?" she whispered. I shook my head. "No way," I assured her. "We're in the middle of nowhere. No cars, no trails, nothing. Who would sleep out here in this weather with no fire, no tent, no gear? It doesn't make sense." To prove she was overreacting, I took another step toward the tarp. My headlamp shined directly on it. It moved. We both froze. My brain refused to process the possibility. It had to be the wind, right? But then the tarp shifted again. Someone was underneath it. My heart pounded. My girlfriend started backing up the slope. I stayed frozen, watching as the tarp stirred. Then I heard a deep, groggy moan. Whoever was under there was waking up. "Run!" I barely whispered. Before I could even finish, my girlfriend was scrambling up the rocky incline. I turned and bolted after her, slipping on the wet stones. Behind me, I could hear whoever was under the tarp moving, rocks shifting as they stood up. Were they following us? Trying to stay rational despite the panic, I called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" Silence. Not a word. That was all I needed to hear. I sprinted up the rest of the incline. We burst out onto the overlook, panting, my girlfriend in near tears. I quickly explained everything to my friend and his girlfriend, who were now just as freaked out. The worst part? We couldn't even leave, our keys were still locked in the car. The rain poured down harder as we huddled under a tarp for warmth. My friend walked around trying to find even a hint of cell service. I kept my eyes locked on the trailhead, just in case whoever was down there decided to come up. Finally, my friend reached a locksmith. You don't even want to know how much he paid for an after-hours emergency call, but someone eventually arrived. We explained what had happened, and the locksmith's face darkened. "You all need to get the hell out of here," he warned. "This area's got a history. People disappearing, hikers turning up dead. Some folks live out here for reasons you don't want to know." That was all we needed to hear. We abandoned our plans and drove straight home, the entire ride back dead silent. To this day, I still wonder, who was that person? Were they running from something? Just a reckless survivalist? How did they end up there with no shelter, no fire, and no transportation? The thought still keeps me up some nights. I also learned a hard lesson that night. I never should have taken my girlfriend there, especially at night, especially in the rain, and especially with no cell service. I had been too confident, too careless. If anything had gone wrong, no one would have found us. I don't set up camp at night anymore. And our girlfriends? They never asked to go camping with us again. We never went back. Back when I was in school, I was pretty well known, but I had about 4 really close friends. Mia, Lucas, Evan, and Jenna. We spent a lot of time together, going on all kinds of adventures, camping, road trips, beach outings, you name it. Evan's family had a lot of money, and all of our parents were pretty laid back when it came to rules. One summer, just before we started 8th grade, we planned a camping trip. Jenna's older sister, Casey, and Lucas's older brother, Tyler, came along, so there were 7 of us in total. Lucas, Jenna, and I were 13, Evan and Mia were 14, and Casey and Tyler were both 17. We picked a camping spot in a forest about 20 miles away from Evan's house. It was basically in the middle of nowhere, with Evan's neighborhood being the closest place with any houses. There was no phone signal, no electronics, nothing. We reached the site without any trouble and set up camp. The girls took one tent, the boys took another. Looking back, maybe it wasn't the best idea to let a bunch of teenagers, age 13 to 17, go camping without any phones in the middle of the woods, but our parents trusted us. The forest had no history of anything dangerous, so they weren't worried. After pitching the tents, we went swimming in a nearby lake, then returned to cook dinner over a fire. The fire was about 20 feet from the tents, which were spaced about 40 feet apart. After roasting marshmallows and doing all the typical camping stuff, Jenna and Casey decided to call it a night. That left me, Lucas, Evan, Mia, and Tyler still sitting around, joking and telling scary stories. A little while later, Casey stormed up to us, clearly irritated. She told us to stop messing with their tent. None of us had moved from the fire, and the tents were far enough away that we couldn't have accidentally brushed up against them. She explained that something or someone kept running something along the tent's surface. Tyler brushed it off, saying it was probably just a branch, and Mia and I decided to turn in for the night too. When we got to the tent, Jenna was already asleep. I took the spot closest to the entrance. Casey lay next to Jenna at the far end, and Mia settled between Casey and me. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me up suddenly. Checking my phone, which I'd brought with a portable charger just to take pictures, I saw it was 2:15 a.m. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up, but then I heard it. A faint tapping on the tent fabric. A quiet giggle followed. The laugh sounded deep, possibly from a man, but I couldn't be sure. It went on for what felt like an hour, but in reality, it was probably just a minute or two. Then, everything stopped. I convinced myself I had imagined it or that one of the guys was playing a prank. Telling myself it was just exhaustion and paranoia, I went back to sleep. At dawn, Mia shook me awake, and we all decided to go on a short hike. Since we were staying another night, we split up. Casey, Jenna, Mia, and I went hiking while the boys stayed back to fish and cook. We were gone for about 2 hours. When we returned, the boys were nowhere to be seen. Annoyed, Casey and Jenna went down to the lake to find them, while Mia and I headed back to the tents. That's when I saw it. The tents had been slashed. I screamed, completely panicked. When I finally calmed down, I took a closer look. The cuts were small, like they had been made with a pocket knife. Our tent fabric was thick, so whoever did it had to have put in effort. Mia and I stood there, stunned, until Casey, Jenna, and the boys came running back after hearing our screams. Everyone was freaked out, and we agreed to pack up and leave early. Not only were our tents too damaged to use again, but none of us wanted to stay after that. Then, things got worse. Tyler discovered his car tires had been slashed. With no phone service and no way to drive out, we panicked. Luckily, Casey's tires were fine. She decided to drive Evan and Lucas back to town to call for help and get our parents involved. Since her car was packed with gear, she couldn't fit more than 3 people. That left me, Tyler, Mia, and Jenna waiting at the campsite. We didn't want to stay near the tents anymore, so we started walking toward the main road to shorten the distance Casey would have to drive when she came back. My phone died along the way, but Lucas and Mia still had theirs and kept track of how far we had walked. About 30 minutes in, I heard branches snapping behind us. A chill ran through me. I whispered to Tyler, and he immediately started glancing over his shoulder more frequently. Then, suddenly he shouted, "Run!" Instinctively, I turned around before taking off. 3 figures in dark, hooded clothing were charging toward us. 2 of them had knives. They were huge, each over 6 feet tall. Tyler was 6 feet 1 inch, but he didn't stand a chance against all 3 of them. Even though it was daylight, I couldn't make out their faces because they wore masks. They had to be over 200 pounds each, and the shortest of them was still at least 6 feet 2 inches. I know this sounds unreal, but I swear it happened. I was terrified. We ran as fast as we could, adrenaline fueling us. Finally, the men stopped chasing us. Either they got bored or they decided we weren't worth the effort. We kept going, barely daring to slow down, until we reached the main road. We stayed there, constantly checking over our shoulders until Casey arrived. We told the police everything. They searched the woods but found no trace of the men, no signs of anyone ever being there, and no real evidence of what happened, besides the pictures we had taken of the lake and the destroyed tents. I don't know what would have happened if they had caught up to us. I was tall for my age, about 5 feet 10 inches and only 125 pounds. Mia was much smaller, barely 5 feet 1 inch and maybe 100 pounds. Lucas wasn't much bigger than me, probably 5 feet 9 inches and 135 pounds. If Tyler hadn't been on alert, if he hadn't told us to run when he did, I have no doubt we wouldn't have made it out. I'm beyond grateful we were all fast enough to escape. Back when I was 18, I was part of an outdoor adventure group, similar to Scouts but for older teens and co-ed. I decided to join a week-long camping trip with a mix of people from different crews. Originally, I was supposed to go with my friend from the group, Mia, but a few days before the trip, she backed out. So, I ended up heading into the mountains alone with a bunch of strangers. It wasn't a big deal to me. I could handle myself. When I got there, I realized I was the only one from my crew and the only girl. It felt a little awkward, but most of the guys were friendly and easygoing. They weren't used to having a girl on their trips, but they treated me like one of the gang. However, there was one guy, Mark, who made things uncomfortable from the start. The first day, he wouldn't stop staring at me, his eyes constantly following me. It felt unsettling, but I brushed it off, assuming he was just socially awkward around girls. The next day, we split into pairs for a hike, and I got paired with Mark. He seemed way too eager, almost overly excited about hiking alone with me. He had a thin frame, messy hair, and was a little shorter than me at 5 feet 6 inches. I figured if anything weird happened, I could probably handle him. Before we even started, he kept offering to help me put on sunscreen. I declined multiple times, but he kept insisting until another guy told him to knock it off. While we hiked, Mark kept asking me questions. "How old are you?" he said. 18, almost 19, I answered. "Oh, don't lie," he smirked. "You look like you're barely 15. So innocent." His questions started harmless, where I lived, if I had siblings, my favorite color, but then he abruptly shifted topics. "Have you ever heard of BDSM?" My stomach twisted. I pretended I didn't know what he was talking about and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. He didn't take the hint and went into detail about it. At that point, I was beyond uncomfortable but kept my cool, not wanting to show any fear. Then he started complimenting my skin. "You don't see a lot of girls with such pale skin. Do you use lotion?" He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, gripping my backpack tightly. Every muscle in my body was on edge. I regretted wearing a tank top because I could feel his eyes on me constantly. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Pale skin is the best. You can see all the bruises and rope marks better." I felt like I couldn't breathe. He asked if I was a virgin. Then, he asked if I fantasized about things I refused to put into words. My stomach turned. I finally looked at him, and he was smiling. A disturbing, childlike grin that sent chills down my spine. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my pace, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. He stayed too close. I wanted to run. He must have sensed my fear. Then, I saw another pair of campers ahead and rushed toward them. I insisted we should all hike together. They hesitated, reminding me we were supposed to stay in pairs. But once they saw how shaken I was, they agreed. Mark glared at them silently. When we reached the top of the trail, 2 of the guys offered to switch partners with me for the hike back. Mark looked furious, like I had betrayed him. I didn't care, I accepted immediately. On the way back, my new hiking partner asked if Mark had been bothering me. I downplayed it, saying it wasn't a big deal. I was 18, I didn't want to seem weak over some creepy 16-year-old. As long as I stayed near the others, I figured I'd be fine. That night, I was alone in my tent. Everyone else shared, but since I was the only girl, I had my own. The leaders made sure my tent was far from the boys to keep them from bothering me. But instead of making me feel safe, it only made me more vulnerable. I wished I was closer to the group. Late at night, I heard rustling outside. I assumed it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But then, I heard my tent zipper moving. My heart pounded. I barely opened my eyes, peeking through my sleeping bag. There, in the darkness, I saw an eye staring at me through the tent flap. It was Mark. I froze, gripping my dad's hunting knife hidden in my sleeping bag. I held my breath, staying as still as possible, watching him. He was muttering to himself, breathing heavily. "Are you there?" I thought I heard him whisper. I stayed motionless, pretending to sleep, ready to fight if he stepped inside. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, for what felt like an eternity. Then he left. The next morning, I was exhausted but forced myself to stay close to the other campers. My nerves were shot. The scout leaders were annoyed with me for seeming distracted, but I didn't care. I was constantly on alert. Mark would sometimes creep up behind me, touch my neck, or try to smell my hair. And every night, he watched. One night, he dug through my backpack. Luckily, I kept my clothes and personal items with me in my sleeping bag, so he found nothing. I had grown up in tough situations and learned to rely only on myself. Asking for help never felt like an option. I figured I'd tough it out for the rest of the week. But then, midway through, Mark was suddenly called away by the leaders and sent home. I had a feeling one of the other guys saw something and reported him. While most of the group seemed confused and waved goodbye, one of the guys who had helped me earlier stood with his arms crossed, watching Mark leave. Mark looked genuinely confused, like he had no idea why he was being sent home. It was eerie. I tried to put it out of my mind and enjoyed the rest of the trip. But looking back, the whole thing unsettles me. That kid was beyond strange. I worry that he might end up being something worse, someone truly dangerous. I'm just grateful my dad insisted I bring his hunting knife, even though blades weren't allowed. I never regretted keeping it close. My wife and I went camping for the first time ever in New Mexico as part of our long road trip through the Southwest. I had picked out this amazing spot on a hill that overlooked a breathtaking valley. The site was right next to a steep drop and incredibly secluded, at least 20 miles deep into a national park down rough dirt roads. When we arrived, we set up our tent, hiked around a bit, and took some photos of the area. We noticed a few cars parked nearby around 4 p.m., so we decided to chat with some fellow campers. We had heard there was a strong storm expected that night, and we were a bit nervous about it. The group we spoke to consisted of 4 men from New Mexico, and they assured us it wouldn't be too bad. That was enough to convince us to stay. Later, while wandering around the campsite, we spotted a woman with her dog and another camper. We exchanged smiles and waves before continuing our walk deeper into the woods. Since the storm was on its way, there were only 7 of us left who chose to stay the night. That evening, we watched the sunset, then returned to our tent. We made sure our car was only a short distance away, just in case, and settled in as darkness fell. The sky was completely covered with storm clouds, so there were no stars visible. Since the rain hadn't started yet, we decided to try and sleep early, hoping to rest through the worst of the storm. The wind was relentless, making it difficult to sleep, but eventually we drifted off. Around 10:30 p.m., I woke up to the sound of thunder echoing through the hills and rain pounding against our tent. I felt uneasy, knowing flash floods were common in this area, and I was terrified we might be washed over the cliffside. Still, I convinced myself to sleep and managed to doze off again. Around midnight, I woke up once more, this time because something heavy was hitting the side of our tent. It sounded like someone striking it or dragging something along its surface. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't see a thing. It was pitch dark. The sound happened again every few minutes, and my fear skyrocketed. Then, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps right outside our tent. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then, just on the other side of the tent, I heard a deep sigh. My first thought was that it might be a bear, and I prepared myself for the worst. Desperate, I squeezed my husband's hand over and over, trying to wake him up without making a sound. Instead of quietly realizing something was wrong, he groggily blurted out, "Why are you squeezing my hand?" The moment he spoke, the footsteps stopped. I finally managed to whisper what I had heard. We tried to reason that it was just an animal passing through, but the strange thumping on the tent continued. It was driving me crazy, wondering what was happening. We convinced ourselves it must be chunks of wood or pine cones falling from the trees above us and attempted to get some rest. If we could just make it through the night, we'd laugh about all of this in the morning. Minutes later, the tent suddenly caved in on my husband's side, pressing down onto his head. He whispered that something was pushing it down. My stomach dropped. I was sure a bear had just plopped down right on top of him. He pushed back against it, and we heard the familiar sliding sound we'd been hearing all night. That's when we realized the truth. It had been snowing. The sound against our tent was heavy ice crashing down from the trees. Our tent was weighed down with thick layers of ice, and my husband had to push it up from the inside to shake it off. Relieved that it wasn't a bear, we decided to stick it out for the night. My husband turned on a small light he had packed, hoping it would make us feel safer. At this point, things started feeling normal again. We both closed our eyes and tried to rest. Then, at 3 a.m., our worst nightmare happened. From out of the darkness, we heard a woman screaming. It was a raw, terrified scream, not one of anger, one of absolute panic. She was shouting, "What the hell? Oh my God, what the hell?" Followed by frantic words we couldn't make out, except for one desperate plea, "Help!" My husband and I locked eyes, frozen in fear. I quickly shut off our light and started whispering, panicked, asking what we should do. How was this happening right now? Just when we were trying to decide, the woman screamed again, this time wailing, "No, no, 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 no," as we heard a car tear off into the night. I started crying. We had no idea what was happening, but it was dead silent now, except for the icy rain pelting our tent. It sounded as if she had been left behind, or worse, had been trying to escape something. That was it for me. I could handle bad weather. I could deal with a possible bear outside my tent. I could even tolerate ice crashing onto us in one of the warmest states in the country. But what I could not and would never be able to handle was a woman screaming in terror in the middle of a pitch-black forest at 3 a.m. We decided we had to get out. At first, we considered abandoning our tent and making a run straight for our car, but we forced ourselves to stay calm. We gathered our valuables, shoved them into the car, and moved together, staying close. Once we were inside, I shut the doors and kept the lights off, afraid of drawing attention. My husband hurried back to grab our tent while I started the engine and called 911. I told the dispatcher what we had heard and where we were, and they said they would send officers to check the campsite. The problem? We were in the middle of nowhere. It would take them well over an hour to get there, especially with the storm making the roads nearly impassable. So we left at around 3:30 a.m. As we were pulling away from the site, my husband noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The 4 men we had spoken to earlier, they were gone. All 3 of their cars had vanished, but their tents were still there. Whatever had frightened them away, they had left in such a hurry that they didn't even take their tents with them. As we drove through the dark, one terrifying realization hit me. The thing that had been walking next to our tent hours earlier, it might not have been an animal. It might have been a person. And maybe, just maybe, that person had gone after the woman we had seen earlier. I don't know what happened that night on that lonely mountain, but I hope, with everything in me, that everyone made it out safely. Back in June 2010, I had just ended things with my girlfriend of nearly 3 years. We had moved from Edmonton to Vancouver, and even after the breakup, we were still stuck living together since we didn't really know many people in the city yet. As you can imagine, the situation was tense and uncomfortable. One day, a buddy from my college suggested we go on a weekend camping and fishing trip. I jumped at the opportunity. He had grown up in a rural area about an hour outside of Vancouver, a place called Maple Ridge. It was a beautiful area, full of dense forests, farmland, and winding creeks. We decided to set up camp along a stream called Cedar Creek, which was near some marshlands known for great fishing. We ended up setting our campsite in what was probably a farmer's field, likely trespassing, bordered by a stunning forest. We spent the evening fishing, chatting, and having a few good craft beers. As the night got darker, we made a small fire, roasted some potatoes and sausages, and just enjoyed the moment. It was a great night. We turned in sometime after midnight. We shared a tent, and my buddy fell asleep before me while I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30 a.m. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was being woken up by a weird, high-pitched yipping sound. Still half asleep, it took me a second to fully register what I was hearing. The sound was continuous, almost like an odd coyote. I lay there for a minute listening, then started scrolling through my phone again. The noise was incredibly annoying, and it seemed to be getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it was no more than 10 feet from our tent. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I had seen coyotes before back in Edmonton, and they never seemed like much of a threat, just a bit bigger than a small dog. But what if this one was sick? Or worse, what if it smelled our food? My anxiety started getting the best of me. I nudged my friend to see if he was awake. The noise had woken him too. We whispered about what to do since we had brought nothing to fend off wildlife, not even a flashlight or a pocket knife. Finally, he decided to shine his phone light outside and yell to scare it off. He unzipped the tent, leaned out with his phone's flashlight, and that's when everything changed. His whole body tensed, and he stumbled back inside with this blank, shocked expression. "It's not a coyote," he stammered. "It's a guy. Some weird guy. Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies, but I had never seen someone look that freaked out before." His face was pale, and I could tell he was dead serious. The yipping and howling noises were still happening. Thinking back, they didn't really sound like a coyote, but I guess our tired brains had tried to make sense of them that way. My friend kept insisting I peek out to see for myself. At this point, my heart was pounding. I felt sick, but I had to look. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. And that's when I saw him. He was just a few feet away, swaying slightly. He was wearing a baseball cap. But what really made my stomach drop, what made the whole thing truly terrifying, was that he was dressed in women's lingerie. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. If the high-pitched noises at our tent in the middle of the night hadn't already made that clear, this definitely did. I yanked my head back into the tent and whispered frantically to my friend. We were both frozen with fear, whispering about what to do. Eventually, we decided we had to confront him. My friend took the lead and started shouting, "Hey, get the hell out of here. We're trying to sleep." As soon as he yelled, the noises stopped. Silence. Then we heard it, footsteps, running toward our tent. We both screamed, "Seriously, go away. We have phones. We'll call the cops." The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. We held our breath. Then, after a few unbearable seconds, we heard him walking again, this time heading toward the road. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. The second the first light of dawn appeared, we packed up as fast as we could and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, we talked about what happened, but were mostly embarrassed by how scared we had been. I think because of that, we never really brought it up again. To this day, I still wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there. What was wrong with him? Sometimes I wonder if things would have gone differently if we had been two women instead of two guys. I'm not saying he was a serial killer or anything, but it felt like he was testing us, seeing who was inside that tent. I'll never know, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Back in 2010, I was part of a group of friends who had a yearly tradition of camping at a particular spot for an extended weekend. The place we picked was in a scenic area right on the shore of a vast reservoir, which was located on public land. The reservoir had a dam, so every spring, the water level was usually low or even completely dry, making it possible to walk across. Camping there was allowed as long as people weren't causing trouble or leaving behind a mess, and it was generally an enjoyable experience. The campsites were spaced out enough to give some privacy, but not so much that you couldn't meet other campers. That year, our campsite was on a gentle slope with another site below us and one above. The first night of our trip passed without any issues. On the second day, a group moved into the campsite below us. We didn't pay them much attention and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. Around midnight, the group below became rowdy. They were yelling, shouting, and blasting loud music. Our friend Mark went down to ask them to lower the volume. Instead of listening, one of them punched him in the face. He came back and told us he was almost certain they were high on something. After that, the atmosphere changed, and we all felt uneasy. I was exhausted, so I decided to turn in for the night. Some of my friends stayed up, including Mark and a couple, Sarah and Jake, who had gone to visit another group we had met that day. As I lay in my tent, I could still hear the music and partying from the group below, but I did my best to ignore it and fall asleep. I don't know what time it was when I suddenly woke up. The details are a blur, but I remember sitting straight up as soon as I heard screaming outside. I rushed out of my tent to find complete chaos. One of my friends was clutching his chest, and people were running around, yelling for someone to call 911. I quickly learned what had happened. Shortly after I had gone to bed, The campers from the site below apparently weren't done with Mark. On their way up to our site, they ran into Sarah and Jake, who were walking back. Jake and Mark were of similar build and had the same hair color, so the group mistook Jake for Mark and attacked both him and Sarah, hitting them over the head with a glass bottle. I don't know if the same attackers came to our campsite, but I was told that while everyone else was sitting around the fire, 2 or 3 large men suddenly emerged from the darkness and walked toward them. One was holding a knife and another had a cleaver. Mark saw the weapons and stood up to talk to them, but before he could say much, one of the men stabbed him in the chest. Around the same time, people from the site above had seen the men approaching and rushed down to help. One of them, David, was coming down the hill when the man with the cleaver ran at him and stabbed him in the stomach. Panic broke out. Someone called 911, but the nearest ambulance was over half an hour away. This is the moment I came out of my tent. David was losing blood rapidly, and his friends decided to put him in the back of their car and speed off to meet the ambulance halfway. Mark was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep, and we managed to keep him stable until paramedics arrived. The attackers ran back to their site and took off in an SUV. My boyfriend at the time and I jumped into his car and drove to the entrance to flag down the police when they arrived. Once they got there, we were told to stay put while a K-9 unit was deployed to track down the attackers. By the end of the night, the men were caught. They had attempted to escape by driving across the dry lake bed, but got stuck in a muddy area. As we suspected, they were under the influence of multiple drugs. Thankfully, both David and Mark survived, though David had lost a lot of blood and needed several weeks to recover. Jake and Sarah had large welts on their heads, and one of them may have had a concussion, though I can't remember for sure. It was, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying nights of my life, and a few of us later had to testify against the attackers in court.